Hey there, everybody. Greetings and welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph. I am the host of this show, a show dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So, we're here today to do an episode of Exploring the Prog Verse, or Prog Universe if you prefer. Basically, I've been doing this show bi monthly, alternating it with metal, although I did miss a week because of other stuff going on. But this show will come out today. This is actually going to be a two-parter based on the huge discography that this band has. So I decided that, yeah, I probably should break it into two, the earlier years and then the later stuff. So the band we're going to be doing for this Prog Universe tour is going to be Hawkwind. It's a band I like quite a bit and have grown to like even more as I've been listening through all of their stuff over the last week or so. Trying to get myself completely familiar with them. I do apologize. I'm still a bit under the weather, although the weather has changed drastically. We have a bright, sunny, wonderful day outside today. Not too warm, but still just the fact that the sun has decided to put in a day's work makes him not an employee of the government anymore. Okay. So, starting the band will be doing, like I said, Hawkwind. We're going to start. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a brief history of how they formed. So they are an English rock band, of course. They formed in November of 1969 when Dave Brock and Mick Slattery formed a band called the Famous Cure. So they were playing this band and they started adding guys here and there for their instrumentation. They added John Harrison, they added Terry Hollis, they added Nick Turner, they added Mike Davis. All of these people they brought in to play instrumentation on the album that they were going to make, or play with the band in an instrumentation. They weren't actually making an album at this point. They were just getting people together to put stuff together that they wanted to put together, and then they decided that they keep them in. And then they played at a concert where they were so unorganized that they didn't even have a name. They just kind of threw things together, but they were so impressive that a label approached them and decided to sign them to the label. The first concert they played in as Group X. That's when they got noticed, and so after that they chose the name Hawkwind. And then their first album, they made their first album with Slattery on it, and then he left the band and was replaced by Langdon. And then we're going to get now a bit into the albums. They have a absolute ton of albums. Almost all of the earlier ones I really like. I'm hoping I can survive this without coughing my brains out. So their debut album, which is just a self-titled Hawkwind album, came out in 1970, August 14th, 1970, and featured Dave Brock, Nick Turner, and Hal Lloyd Langston, and John A. Harrison and Terry Hollis. So, in actual fact, Slattery was not credited on this album. I'm not sure that he actually played anything on this album either. I'm assuming he did, although I couldn't find any notes to indicate that he actually did anything, so he wasn't credited at any rate, unless I completely read it wrong. They had this kind of a 60-ish sound vocals to their music, at least on this album they did. Very solid. Lots of that acoustic harmonic stuff that you come to associate with the psychedelic music of that time period. And the beginning of their space element in their music. It wasn't dominating at this point in time, but it was definitely in there. I just noticed there's a line on my lens. I don't know where that came from. Well, it's gone now, whatever it is. Yeah, pretty dominated by guitar, as I think much of their stuff is. Early on, they had more of a psychedelic sound on this particular album than I was accustomed to hearing from them, but very good nevertheless. I like this album quite a bit. The next album out came out in October the 8th, 1971. Now you're going to find with this band, they consistently, over the years, have put out almost an album a year. A few times they've missed a few years, but generally speaking, they put out about an album a year, just consistent. No matter who's coming and who's going. So on their second album, which is entitled In Search of Space, you had Detmar come in here. He joins, Del Detmar, and Dave Anderson also joins, replacing, and you also had Longton and Harrison also playing on this album as well. At least I think that's, my understanding is that's exactly what happened. This is a pretty heavy album. I think it's a step up in heaviness from the first album. There I go, blowing my glasses so I can't even see out of them now. So this might be difficult today. Very spacey, lots of psychedelic stuff. So you got a bit of both here now. So in the first album, much more psychedelic. This album, a lot more of that space element, but still pretty psychedelic album. The album, I think for myself, I think I found this album to be very, very clear sounding. Production was good on it for that time period, I think. Very developed. It was developed well, I think. For a band that didn't show much organizational skills early on, they certainly were able to put together a really solid album here. In 1972, they came out with their third album on the 24th of November. Doremi Faso Latido. Sounds like that thing that you used to do in school. You know what I think it is? I think it's Do, Re, Mi, Fa, Si, La, Ti, Do. Yeah, that's what I think it is. November 24th, 1972, like I said, Dave Anderson and Terry Allis are gone at this point. They're out of the band, replaced by Ian Kilmeister, also known as Lemmy, and Simon King. So, of course, Lemmy comes in and plays the bass, and Simon King, I believe, comes in and plays the drums, if I'm not mistaken here. The bass is much heavier than it was on the previous albums, and dirtier sounding too. Like it's not clean sounding at all. The space sound is continuing here and actually getting stronger. The vocals are still kind of a mid-range, but not scratchy as you were getting earlier on. And it's a bit repetitive. This album is a little bit more repetitive than the first two, which is not a trade that's unfamiliar with Hawkwind. A lot of their stuff fall within a certain range and only vary in certain aspects of it. They don't really tend to go outside a certain sound part. At least early on they didn't anyways. So the next album out, of course, is their big one, which I happen to have here. This one, Hall of the Mountain Grill. So this is the one that kind of really put them on the map, I think. A really solid album, and the artwork here by Barney Bubbles, of course, is great, as he is on all of them. So you've got basically Lemmy, Turner, Brock, Simon House is now in here with Simon King and Del Ditmar. This is the six-man band that put this album together. Much heavier than the previous albums, I think. I think it's probably their heaviest of the ones I've listened to so far. Lemmy is also singing on this album for the first time, and the riffs are really catchy. This is one of the best riffing albums of the whole bunch. Lots of really catchy riffs, and of course, again, you have that great album cover. And they repeat that on their next album, which I also have, which is up here in my playlist, which is this one. And so that I don't screw up like I did during the week and pissed one particular guy off, this is Warrior on the Edge of Time. Not at the Edge of Time. That's what I probably said without looking at the video, but it's Warrior on the Edge of Time. So I stand corrected. This was released on May the 9th, 1975. The lyrics in this particular album were based on Michael Moorcock. He did most of the writing here. So you have featured on this album is Brock, Turner, Lemmy, House, King, and then Alan Powell as well on this. And I think Moorcock actually sings some vocals on this. Yeah, I believe he does sing some stuff on here. Anyways, really good album, very catchy, more spacey, just a continuation of the whole Hall of the Mountain Grill, but a little bit more spacey even. Really heavy, really catchy, really strong album. Either one of these is probably my favorite of the discography, but they're just so good. So then they moved on to the next album, which is Astounding Sounds. A little bit different. You've got Robert Cavell coming in here, or Cavert. Is it Cavert or Cavell? I always thought it was Cavell, but I guess it's Cavert. Vocals. Brock, Turner, Paul Rudolph on bass, replacing Lemmy Kilmister, and King and Powell in here as well. I always wondered why they had a need for two drummers, but I mean, they must have had some need for it. There's other bands that have done this too, but I didn't realize they had two drummers on a couple of their albums. This is a bit more moderate in sound, not nearly as heavy, I don't think. Vocals are stronger here, though, I think, overall. Quirky lyrics. The sounds are good. Not as heavy, but more, I guess, a range, more of those strange sounds is what I'm trying to think. I'm trying to think of how I want to say this. So a little bit more of that strange oddities that you get with bands like Pink Floyd and Eloy, like the throw noises in there. The bass is a little bit distant here, cleaner sounding, but not as prominent as it was on the previous albums. It's a little bit toned down and pushed back. I think they're trying to capture a less aggressive sound, and maybe that's part of the reason why Lemmy was asked to leave. I don't know. I don't know for a fact what exactly happened there. You know, you hear different things, but you know. Anyways, we'll go on to the next album, which is 1977's Quark, Strangeness, and Charm. June 17th, 1977. This features Brock Calvert, Simon House, Adrian Shaw on bass taking over, and Simon King on drums. So you've got a pretty strong, I don't think I mentioned, no I didn't mention Brock, but I think that was just a gimme. So Brock is also on this album, of course. This is a typical space rock, lots of noises, lots of voices, there's little conversations going on in the background, some quirky lyrics here, and some almost talking like vocals. It's almost like a narrative in some ways, I guess you could call it that. It's a much clearer album than the previous one. It's more straight ahead rock and roll on some of the stuff, which is a little bit heavier as well. Excuse me. I did like this album quite a bit, though, of the earlier albums. So this is their seventh at this point. Of those earlier albums, this was one of the ones I liked quite a bit. So yeah, really solid album. The next album out, they had a little bit of a problem here. So my understanding is that they had a break with their management. Now, I don't know if that meant the management with the record label or their own personal management, or maybe they were the same. I'm not sure. But they had a break with them, and they decided, because there was some legal issues over the use of the name, they decided to call this one Hawklords. So they didn't use the name Hawkwind on this album. They used the name Hawklords. The album is called 25 Years On, released October the 6th, 1978. You know, a lot of bands, when they have these kind of problems with their management, whether it's the record label management or their own personal management, there's usually quite a delay before they do another album, because it usually takes time. But not these guys; they just keep piling them in there. This one was about a little bit longer than normal. It was a little bit over a year and a little bit for them, which is very long for them. So this was released by under the name Hawklords, October 6, 1978. You got Brock, Cavert. Sorry, I can never get this guy's name right. Yeah, Bainbridge is on this album too. Sorry, I was thinking about something. Steve Swindell on keyboards, King, Martin Griffin on drums this time. So it was based. The band used the name Hawklords because of the dispute, and it's got a very different sound to it, though. I found very new wave-ish, almost poppy in some ways. Very melodic guitar sound, and not totally dissimilar from what they had in the past. There are some spacey parts and some heavy parts on this album at times, but overall I found it to be more new wave-ish than anything I'd heard them do before this. Yeah, it's really a little bit different. So the next album out, which came out in June 15th, 1979, they went back to using their Hawkwind label, and this album is called PXR5. This is an album I've listened to several times. It was actually given to me in one of my I think it was either in Ben's album challenge or one of the album wars, but I listened to this entire thing, and then I listened to it again while I was doing this. It was released June the 15th, 79. You got Brock, Calvert, House, Shaw, King, all playing on this album. Some punk on this album. That was the biggest thing about this album I found. It had the punk element to it, or maybe punk might be overstating it. Maybe it's a little more like proto-punk. It had a punk element to the music for sure. Definitely clearly like that, and the more of a new wave-ish sound overall of the album. But still, again, having that spacey and heavy element that is so characteristic of their music. But definitely a little bit moving towards that more punky flavor. Proto-punk, I guess, maybe what you want to call it. The next album up, Levitation, 1980. This is the first one in the 1980s. This is also their 10th studio album. So they produced one every single year. They never missed a year. You got Brock, Hal Lloyd Langton on guitars, Harvey Bainbridge on bass and keyboards, Tim Blake on keyboards, and Ginger Baker on the drums. Yes, the legendary Ginger Baker playing on this album. They actually said, based on my readings, is that he knew exactly what they needed from him, and he gave them everything they wanted. They were really pleased with his drumming. And for me, it's good to hear this because I'm not a huge proponent of Ginger Baker, as many people know. But I've never, ever taken away from his drumming ability. He's got to be one of the top drummers of all time, especially in the rock genre. And I can't really speak to the other genres because I don't really listen to them much. This is more of a heavy, more heavy and more catchy. I found this album a lot more similar to their first album than any of the other ones that came after that one. And I liked it for that reason, because that was one of my albums that I really liked quite a bit. Of course, the drumming is notably better on this album than its predecessors. There's a lot of different stuff here that you don't really get to hear much of on the predecessing albums. So Baker is, of course, playing here and is very strong. Again, the spacey sound is still there and still pretty dominant, I think. Then you come to the 1981 album Sonic Attack. This was released in October of 1981, featuring Brock, Langdon, Bainbridge, Martin, Griffin, and Michael Moorcock on vocals on one track. He just sang on one track here. Griffin was a drummer, by the way. I don't know if I mentioned that. Heavy album, but it's a little bit of a new age sound, which is not something I really care for, but there's a little bit of that in there. The guitar is dominant, as per usual. There's nothing unknown by that. It's got a bit of the 80s pop flavor to it, though. A little bit too much for my liking, but I don't dislike the album. I don't think I've disliked any of their albums. It's just that certain flavors on the album I'm not as crazy about as other sounds. Now we get to the 1982 album, Church of Hawkwind. This again is another use of another name other than Hawkwind. This is called the Church of Hawkwind by the Church of Hawkwind. I'm not really sure what the issue was here. Maybe it was a change. It might have been a musical change in direction. It was a little bit different here than some of their other stuff, and maybe they didn't want to put it under the Hawkwind label, so put it under Church of Hawkwind. Not really sure what their rationale was it. So you got Brock, Langton, Bainbridge, and Griffin on this album. This is a much more poppier album, kind of a new wave-ish thing going on here. I think that's probably the reason why they chose to call it a Church of Hawkwind. Although I don't find it that much more new wave-ish than any of some of the other stuff that they've done on some of the past albums where they were clearly going in that direction as well. But this one, I guess, they just decided they didn't want to put it under that label. Okay, I'm going to take a drink because I'm really starting to lose my concentration. Okay, so we're going to do this. This will be the final album for the first episode of the series. I broke it from 1970 to 82, so this will be their 13th studio album. Yeah, 13 in 12 years. Yeah, this is a prolific band. October 29th, 1982. Choose Your Mask is the name of the album. You got Brock, Langton, Bainbridge, and Griffin on this album. Lots of noise effects on this album, I found. Quite a bit of them. Feels more Hawkwind-like than the predecessor. There is some new wave instrumentation on this album as well, so it's not completely devoid of that element of music, but it's not nearly as prolific. So, when in hindsight, probably I can see why they might have chose not to call it a Hawkwind album and called it the Church of Hawkwind, because it was a little bit different and outside the normal for them. And who knows what other reasons they had for it. So anyways, that's the first episode of this Hawkwind kind of tour. I'm going to try and do the remaining, and I think there's now 27, so the remaining 14 albums next week when I do part B. Now, Hawkwind has talked about doing an album this year, of course, because it's another year, right? So there has been talk about it, but I don't think I've seen anything as of yet on any of that happening. But my guess is something will happen. So we're going to get into their second. I decided to break it off here because 13 and then you got 14 coming, so it's probably about the halfway point. Plus we did a little bit of that other stuff at the beginning, so kind of will be about halfway. So I actually enjoy this band a lot. Much more than I originally had thought. I thought my original thoughts were that they had too much of that AC/DC sound. Not that they sound anything like AC/DC, but where they just keep repeating the same album after album. That's what was my original thought. But I've discovered by listening to their albums that there are quite a few differences in most of their albums. Although they still have that basic Hawkwind sound throughout all of their albums, but there's still enough differences amongst them that you could separate the albums fairly easily. So anyways, I hope you enjoyed this first of two-part episodes on exploring the prog versus featuring Hawkwind, and I hope to see you on part B. So please do not forget to hit the like and subscribe and hit the notification bell. That's above me, actually, and make your comments below. I do apologize for my being under the weather. I know it's made me a little bit scattery, trying not to be, but just do the best I can. Anyways, I hope to see you then, and take care, and goodbye.